Thanks, so Grace, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for showing up. So it's really my pleasure to be part of this conference. It's really very nice and engaging global event that has a low entry and allows us to have interesting, nice conversations. So what I'm going to talk about today is about having the abilities and opportunities for learners to empower them with something that I'm going to define as adaptive skills for the age of AI. In terms of the context, I think everybody is fairly familiar with the different contexts and different pressures that we need to think about when we are engaging with the generative AI that unleash the broader global conversations about the implications on work and learning. So some are anticipating that there'll be lots of exposure to different types of skills to generative AI, while others are also reporting potential productivity gains in different organizational contexts, such as organizational problem-solving support, and the way that is actually that benefits are primarily also benefiting productivity of those who are early in their careers. However, we also have lots of panic around the world, spreading as the Financial Times dubs it as jobocalypse, and that kind of anxiety that many graduates are thinking and companies are saying, oh, we don't know whether we want to hire anybody in the entry types of jobs. And there are some stats that are showing the reductions in the hiring. On the other hand, there are also studies showing, and Yale just published a study as well, showing that, well, we can't really attribute many of these things to AI precisely, but it's really a much more complex issue. At the same time, we also know that generative AI is not perfect. It hallucinates. It's not reliable. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about that later. However, many people just let it slip. We've seen many stories about lawyers across the world, US, Australia, you name it, many of them even getting fined because they would allow some of the Meta court cases cited in their court filings. And at the same time, also even that is spreading now into the consultants who are serving different governments and I'm sure many corporations as well. So we would always traditionally be saying, well, education is here to help us address some of the problems. The issue is with the generative AI is that it's sort of hacked the way how education operates. It is not only the issue of the integrity of some of our assessments, but it's also becoming a sort of a wayside thing for many learners to find shortcuts to do particular types of things. At the same time, while many universities around the world are showing some pockets of innovation, they're also focused on the policy. And even this morning, I'm reading the news in different Australian newspapers, how universities are still trying to use AI detectors to accuse students for cheating and plagiarism because of the use of AI, which is really not the best way because we really need to reinvent the way how and what we are actually thinking about the human learning, human skills, and the way how we need to reconceptualize them. And so this is the core proposition for me is that I want to make for you today is that we need to really think about the adaptive learners who can not only navigate the complexities of the changing job landscapes, which require adoption and use of some of new types of skills, and over the careers they will be required to upskill or reskill many more times probably than we had to do that in the past. But also the challenge of the distraction to some of the core learning perspectives that we need to have in terms of that certain things can be performed easily. So you may then ask me, Dragan, well, isn't AI literacy enough to address some of these problems? And indeed, there's lots of investment into the AI literacy around the world, many different types of measurement instruments, many different schools, organizations, everybody's trying to upskill in terms of the AI literacy. I would say, and you will see today as well, that's a necessary but not sufficient what we need to envision. The key point for us is to actually develop human skills while benefiting from the power of generative AI. And the reason why I'm saying this is twofold. This is how I'm going to be framing and conceptualizing for the rest of the talk these skills. While we have traditionally been thinking in terms of the human learning along the line of providing them with different types of scaffolding approaches with the aim to improve human skills, and we could also use some of the AI technologies, including generative AI technologies, to improve some of these human skills. There's this other line that AI is allowing us, and those are our AI assistants or AI support tools. They're primarily intending to enhance our performance. And that leads us basically to this corner, what I'm calling is high empowered skills. But you can also call it the corner of autopilot performance in many ways, for as long as these type of AI technologies are good fit for the task, and we also have some skills to use some of these AI tools. The ultimate goal is really that we have this synergy between human and AI empowered skills. And the open question is how to get there. But you can see from this whole model is that the key assumption is that this synergy only happens when humans have high levels of skills. And that's a really challenging in terms of the discourse that we are seeing now, how expertise is diminishing and how AI-empowered skills can do lots of things for us. So then the big question becomes is, how do we prepare the learners to embrace this type of synergy? Because learners already have limitations in their abilities to adapt their learning to different types of challenges. And I'm going to be actually discussing some of these things. So in other words, the primary question I want to answer today with you is the extent to which AI use can help or hurt human learning, and what are the necessary ingredients to address some of these issues. I usually like to give immediately also my key takeaways as well, so you actually don't get too distracted or don't get bogged down into some of the details as well. I'm going to be speaking in the rest of my talk today. So the first one is that there is no really free lunch for adaptive learners. The key issue is that this synergy of human and AI-empowered skills is really not easy to achieve without human skills being developed first. The second takeaway is that for many learners, including the workers, we can observe frequently metacognitive laziness and some level of overreliance if we see unsupported use of generative AI. In other words, we become much lazier to think about our own thinking, and that explains why some of our lawyers or consultants are also potentially getting in trouble. And the third final point, which is really very critical, is that we still are missing robust evidence on the implications of the use of AI on learning in terms of the long-term ways how that is shaping what people do or not. We mostly have some small snapshots and different types of cross-sectional studies. All right, so those are the conclusions. I'm going to now go into some foundations. I'm going to define some of the key concepts that are quite essential for us to understand what is happening in this space. First of all is, how do we currently prepare learners for the age of AI, especially if we want them to be adaptive? Lots of my understanding about the adaptivity of human learning is shaped by the literature on metacognition, in other words, thinking about our own thinking, and specifically also in the different conceptual and theoretical models of self-regulated learning. I'm going to posit today that metacognition sits at the very heart of the adaptive skills that learners need to have. While on the left side, you can see a very complex model by Alison Hadwin and Phil Whinney of self-regulated learning. We're going to zero in onto the two key processes that are quite essential for human adaptivity when it comes down to the metacognition and their learning. One is the metacognitive control, that is specifically meaning what kind of learning strategies, tactics, and tools we are using and deploying and adapting in different types of learning situations. And the other one is the monitoring, that is to the extent to which we are capable to effectively check how we are progressing with our learning, how we are evaluating our products of learning, and the extent to which we are then enacting the control of our learning so that we can adapt to different types of situations. So I'm going to now go quickly into these two critical processes. First one is in terms of the metacognitive control, is that learners construct knowledge through the use of learning strategies. And the literature on learning strategies is using also many different names: learning techniques, learning approaches, you name it. But there's a lot of literature that is also framed around the different types of toolboxes that students need to have, that is demonstrating that learners in certain situations can maximize their durable learning if they are effectively, for example, distributing their practice, or if they are also self-testing, or if they are, which is I think quite pertinent to today's conversations, trying to engage into the elaborative interrogation or trying to self-explain certain types of phenomena. That's a good thing. We have that evidence. Not so good thing is that literature consistently showing that learners, that includes even the students in the top universities around the world, and that means also many workers and more mature people, have a very limited repertoire of the learning strategies. In other words, people technically always or have a high propensity to engage into the use of ineffective learning strategies. Metacognitive monitoring is another important thing that I mentioned, that is shaping the way how we can be more adaptive in certain situations. We are pretty autonomous in the way how we are making decisions about our own learning. At the heart of it, it's really our judgments about how well we think we know something, how fast we are progressing with our learning, how well we perform particular tasks, and so on. But what we also know is that we are generally highly inaccurate about the judgments of our learning. Some of you probably heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So in other words, that majority of the learners are overconfident, and the detrimental side of that point is that they would stop working or learning even though they are not meeting particular criteria that is important to do. In other words, many people are not great at self-assessing what they are doing in certain types of situations. But there's even a bigger challenge when it comes down to the metacognitive monitoring, and that is also the issue of processing fluency. That's one of the things that is probably one of the fundamental weaknesses of our cognitive architectures that we have. And that is that we often have a tendency to be much less critically engaged with certain information if that information is presented in a very articulate, nice way. In other words, something that is easy to read doesn't always mean it's easy to understand. And it's also quite connected with the literature in behavioral economics as well, that is talking about systems 1 and 2 and the way how that is done. And we know that generative AI is generating very articulate, convincing content. The final thing is that metacognition also plays a really important role in the way how we are approaching different types of information problems. From finding relevant information, selecting that information, trying to process that information and to turn it into certain written products. What we also know from the literature as well is that many learners, including the students of the top medical schools in the world, are using generally unreliable sources and suboptimal search strategies. I usually like to say for this example, just a very, very anecdotal experience as well. Many years ago, I ended up in emergency room, and I had a fairly false alarm as well with that. But when you're married to a medical doctor, they love to be actually that we are always taken care of by other doctors. So I got much better, and I was observing what doctors were doing in the emergency. And then in the emergency room was this big screen, and every 5-10 minutes, physicians would approach to that screen, do a quick search. I would see Google, and then majority of the pages they were opening were Wikipedia, because it was easy to find that information. So we can discuss whether there was good or not source at the time, but imagine the extent to which they could also start to use generative AI. So having that all said, there are generally two major risks I want to highlight. First one is that even if you are using some of these existing adaptive learning systems, even with different types of adaptive tutors, they can be often really good at supporting really nice dosage regimes of cognitive unloading. In other words, giving us the right amount of the cognitive effort that needs to be engaged into so that we progress in our learning. However, majority of the decisions in terms of the metacognitive control and judgment is offloaded onto the AI. And so this is this side, horizontal side of the learning that many of us studied for the last many years. However, the question becomes what happens on this other dimension of the performance where we are using different types of AI assistants? Is the big risk that we start now offloading everything, all our metacognition and our cognition? So that becomes a really big question that I want to answer with you and also explore what does the evidence tell us about this very specific issue. Do we become really completely metacognitively lazy with so much potential offloading due to the performance emphasis of different types of AI technologies? Okay, I'm going to now dive into a particular type of impact that we are seeing and what is emerging from the existing evidence in the literature. I'm going to also specifically give you the types of ways we are using, and we think it's really the most promising ways to study the way how people are developing their metacognitive abilities, exercising them in different types of situations, as well as how we can do that in a more impartial ways. To do some of these types of things, we developed the whole environment, which we call Flora, which not only is allowing us to collect very granular data about people's interaction with different types of learning or working tasks. Every mouse move, every click, any keystroke can be recorded, but we can also get their intentions through the analysis of different types of highlights, taking different types of notes, different tools for planning, also different types of tools for essay writing and so on. But at the same time, we can also embed different types of chatbots inside of it. And you will see in a few moments as well how that's done. In other words, this tool is becoming almost like our microscope through which we can look what is happening when people are engaging into different types of tasks that require exercises of adaptation through metacognitive monitoring and control. So what we are doing under the hood, we are trying to basically map these granular data about learners' interactions with the technology into the processes of metacognition and cognition. And we've done lots of work in the last 20 years across many groups in the world, and specifically in our team as well, we've been working on that. Conceptually as well, there's a framework proposed by a colleague Inge Molinar that is quite helpful to understand the learning side of the development of the human skills, and which is called hybrid human AI regulation, which basically says, hey, learners have really limited metacognitive abilities, so we need to do lots of AI regulation. In other words, AI is doing lots of decision-making for the students as well as the control to the level that we equip enough learners to do many of these things on their own. And then in these type of situations, then system is only giving them follow-up analytics and help them to better reflect on how they can improve next time. But the issue with the hybrid human AI regulation, it's been primarily focused on this left-hand side of the model that I mentioned, and is trying to emphasize metacognitive unloading. In other words, returning back much more students the agency to exercise their metacognitive monitoring and control over their learning processes. However, becomes a big question, is this applicable also on this right-hand side and the extent to which we can use it to help us understand it. All right, I'm going to now dive quickly through three major questions that we can answer based on the existing evidence in terms of the extent to which different types of AI scaffolding approaches supporting learning can influence metacognitive control. Then I will look into the metacognitive monitoring, and finally, different types of information problem solving tasks. So what we basically so far see is that AI, generative AI in particular, can be used to articulate feedback, or we call them often scaffolds, based on the students' interactions with the different types of AI systems. And that can be used then to help promote better choices of learning strategies that students can enact in different types of situations. What we've seen so far in different studies is that there is a moderate positive association between these type of AI-supported approaches and the choices students are making in terms of their learning strategy. We initially looked at in higher education, found that effect, and then last year we did also a study that was replicated in 6 countries at the same time, and we found also the similar effect in secondary education. In other words, we were able in this particular situation to move students in terms of their metacognitive abilities and abilities to adapt better to the problems they were working on with a little bit of support and nudging. However, the ideal corner is really how we get a synergy. And one of the hypotheses that we have is to integrate these scaffolds with the AI support or AI assistance. In other words, we are now preparing a large study in which we want to have 3 specific types of conditions. One group of students will be just using regular vanilla type of ChatGPT to perform some of the tasks. Some students will be using this type of scaffolding to boost their metacognitive skills. And the third group will be using combination of the two. In other words, can we help with the combination of the two students to balance between learning and performance? And so this is how it looks. So students will be allowed to use ChatGPT, but over time, they will be also getting particular types of scaffolds that are nudging them in the direction of also better decision-making and the choices of the learning strategies as they are progressing their work on the tasks. So this is an open call. So far, we line up 25 different education systems around the world, and we are basically hoping by next time this year, we'll be able to report some of our preliminary findings of this relatively large study. The interesting thing is also that we are trying to do it as a large replication study. In other words, each of these jurisdictions will be having powered enough study for each of them so that we can meta-analyze the extent to which this effect holds homogeneously across all these different cultures and different education systems. The next big question is the extent to which we can actually see what are the effects of generative AI on metacognitive monitoring, which is another big thing for the adaptivity or maladaptivity of the learners in certain situations. So what we basically are, and that's what we hypothesize long time, is that generative AI, in principle, can lead to worsen metacognitive monitoring. In other words, that lots of the important judgments are completely offloaded and students are taking the information on almost face value of what is offered to them. There was an interesting study published last year in this space in which they were basically asking the learners to use some of these human-provided responses on different question answering fora versus the responses provided by ChatGPT. And for a considerable amount of learners, they prefer ChatGPT, although in more than 50% of the cases, the information contained by ChatGPT was false. And in more than 70%, almost 80% of the cases, that information was also quite verbose. Yet many learners said, well, I prefer ChatGPT because it sounds better. So this is basically quite consistent with the hypothesis that I had about the processing fluency. So in other words, what we see here is for a significant proportion of the students, they remain in the low level of the skills of exercising their metacognitive monitoring because they applied a particular tool that is also not good fit for the task. However, AI can also offer us good scaffolds that are promoting better human judgments through the metacognitive monitoring. This is the implementation of the same tool that I mentioned before, that is having some of these scaffolds for the students to better monitor and make decisions about their own writing. Specifically, the tool would allow them different types of analytics to do some of these things. For example, one of these analytics is to help them judge how they are integrating certain information from various sources that we also provided them with. What we did with this particular tool was that we then run a lab experiment in which we asked initially learners to write an essay based on a set of documents, and they were working on that task for about 2 hours. Then the learners were randomized into 2 conditions, and they were asked to revise their essays. One group had the access to this analytics tool, and the other group did not, just continued using vanilla writing without any particular support. What's really striking is that the accuracy of the students' judgments about their quality of the essays that they wrote was far more accurate, much higher than it was for the learners who did not have that type of support. In other words, that we can, through these type of scaffolds, push to the learners the right type of information that can unobtrusively help them to make better judgments. But obviously, not everything is even there perfect, because when we interview the learners afterwards and ask them for those fewer cases that they missed in terms of their accuracy of the judgments that they were making about their self-assessments, many of the learners just blame AI by saying, hey, it was not my fault, it's the AI's fault. And that basically is concerning because that we are seeing potentially this transition to the external locus of control, that somebody else is there that I can actually blame for anything that I am supposed to be doing is not doing things for me. The big question is, though, is what is the longer term effect if I'm not using the scaffolding tool that is helping me to learn, but rather if I'm using the AI assistant or AI support tool to help me to boost my performance. And I saw here in the room as well, we have Ali Darvishi, who actually ran this really interesting study at the University of Queensland. And the idea was there to solve the problem of the students who are not really providing great feedback in different types of situations. So the idea was then to provide the learners with an AI support tool so that the learners can improve their judgments of their colleagues' work, and then by that extension, provide them also better quality feedback. So then the study was done in such a way that about 1,600 learners were initially all provided with this AI support, and the study was running for 4 weeks. Then the learners were, in the following 4 weeks, randomized into 4 conditions. One group continued using that AI support. One group had no support at all. One group got the replacement for the AI tool with a small rubric which would help them better themselves improve the monitoring of what is going on and make better judgments about what they were also providing in terms of the feedback. And one group received a combination of the AI tool and the tool and this small rubric that was promoting their own metacognitive monitoring. So what are the key findings? Interestingly, when the group of the learners who were using the AI support lost the access to that tool, their quality of feedback significantly dropped. In other words, they were just primarily over-relying on the use of the tool to make their decisions and check the quality of what was done, but they were not internalizing much in terms of their learning. In other words, they returned to relatively low skills of their feedback and the quality of the monitoring that they were doing there. Some benefits were present when AI support was replaced with scaffolds, which is really cool. It was not as effective as when you were just offloading that to the AI tool, but this is not particularly novel. We've been doing similar types of things in education for many years as well, except it was really interesting to compare it to the way how people are doing. What was also interesting here is that there was no additive effect of the AI scaffold and AI tool. So what we basically observed is that learners were either in this high AI-empowered skills, or they were also nudging towards high human skills, but there was no this like upper right corner that was actually the desirable corner we want our learners to adapt toward. So this has really lots of important implications for our understanding of the adaptivity of the learners and broader development of the human skills in the age of AI. First and most important thing is here to distinguish between learning and performance. In other words, if I'm using a particular AI assistant that I can perform better in the task, it does not mean that I have better skills myself. I just basically know how to have the tool to use, and maybe I get lucky in certain situations because I don't know how to check whether that's reliable or not. That also has direct implications on two important things. First one is the future of the assessment, where we need to move away from the assessing the product only to incorporate and account for two important things. The processes, in other words, how and what steps learners took to solve a particular problem or perform a particular task. And secondly, also how they were exercising their metacognitive monitoring and what judgments they were making along the way. And the second important thing is also that we need to move away from the studies that are claiming that generative AI can improve academic performance. Who cares if we are measuring the genuine learning and the abilities of the learners to adapt to the changed context that is really essential? So then, really, we still have this big challenge. How do we develop then synergy of high human AI-empowered skills? So we recently see that maybe the type of scaffolding that we are doing can play a big role. We just published this randomized study in the context of the learner's interaction with different types of visualizations, where we had some group of learners have a chatbot, which was just like a regular passive ChatGPT type of thing. They could ask all sorts of questions and it would basically provide them explanations, versus the chatbot, which was actually not giving direct answers to the learners, but proactively asking learners the questions that they themselves needed to answer onto the dashboard. Both groups recorded significant improvements when they were using the chatbots. But on the next task, when the chatbot was removed, the passive group maintained that improved performance, while the proactive group continued improving their performance. In other words, that the type of scaffolds that as well, in other words, pedagogy, can help our learners better internalize the ways how they are making the judgments and the strategies that they are using in certain situations. Final set of studies I want to talk about is the use and importance of the adaptivity through the exercise of metacognitive monitoring on information solving problem tasks. So it becomes the question is, what is the effect of generative AI in these type of tasks? I'm going to quickly go through one study in which we really wanted to see the extent to which learners are using ChatGPT when they are working on information problem solving tasks. In other words, set of source documents they were using, and then they were also asked to do a particular writing performance. So the experimental setup was very similar to the one I previously mentioned. So learners wrote for 2 hours on an essay without any generative AI or any of the support. And then after that, they got a break of 1 hour, and then they got another hour to revise their essays. One group got access to the ChatGPT tool, while the other group got access to a chat interface where on the other side, there was a human. Students knew there was a human, and human only interacted with one student at a time for the entire hour of the study. So in terms of the actual performance, unsurprisingly, the writing performance for the group who used ChatGPT was higher than for the group who had access only to the human expert. However, when we looked into the process data and the ways how they were engaging into metacognitive monitoring, how they were engaging into the use of different types of strategies, we observed that in almost 50% of the cases, learners had a complete denial or deactivation of their metacognitive monitoring and metacognitive control while they were doing things. We basically were observing that learners were just slapping information that ChatGPT would spit out and then moving on. And we label this type of things as metacognitive laziness. In other words, reduction in the metacognitive activity, both control and monitoring in the situation when they are interacting with generative AI. And then when they were interacting with the human teachers, in great majority of the cases, learners were just exercising and carefully checking any information they were receiving through the help they were seeking from the human expert on the other side. Now a big question becomes this: what are the long-term implications on the reduction of metacognitive monitoring, control, planning? Does that mean much less adaptivity rather than much more adaptivity to much more challenging context in which learners need to operate? That may lead probably to the atrophy of our cognitive as well as metacognitive abilities. This is one hypothesis. Emerging evidence is telling us that it's likely. This nice study, also published late last year, showed that when learners were using ChatGPT versus just regular search engines, they were reporting with ChatGPT reduction in cognitive load, but also significant reduction in their critical reasoning about the information, about the certain scientific information they were asked to investigate. So that's a pretty concerning thing. And why this is concerning? Because despite of lots of claims about the improvements of large language models and the use of bigger and bigger data sets, the neural models are actually not demonstrating significant improvements in the reduction of the hallucinations and also in the reduction of the inaccuracy of the information that they are providing. So these numbers are still between 45 and 50%. You basically can look into one of the recent models that was basically in May, and even at the release of GPT-5, hallucinations are really not improving. Why this is important for us in terms of the student adaptivities and the ways we need to engage with some of these things. Recently, OpenAI also demonstrated different ways people are using information for. And you can see that in almost 20% of the cases, people are looking for specific information that is relevant for whatever types of things that they are seeking for. And the other important thing is that there's a considerable number of people who seek information and support in terms of tutoring or teaching or different types of advice. How can they do some of these things when they are getting disarmed in terms of their adaptivity to the particular types of tasks that they need to perform? Similarly, also Anthropic, another big player in this whole game, released earlier this year also the ways how students are using generative AI. And we are actually seeing that majority of these type of usages are actually on the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So if that's the case, then how do we assure that learners are developing higher order skills when they are over-relying on different types of technologies, such as this one? All right, so this is the evidence. I'm going to give a bit more direction as well where we need to be going before I wrap up. It'll take another 5 minutes or so. So I started from this premise. There's risk number one, is that even when we are supporting our learners with really great intelligent tutoring systems and other types of systems, that we are still offloading learners' metacognition, which is the key mechanism for our adaptivity in different types of situations. We see that that is actually something that we can deal with and see a really good opportunity with different types of AI and personalized scaffolds that metacognitive engagement and better choices of learning strategies can happen if they are provided timely. But I also start from this other risk, this dark side in terms of the dark side of the moon as well. We don't understand well, is that maybe on that other side, everything is being offloaded. What we are seeing as the evidence that both cognition and metacognition is increasingly being offloaded if we are actually getting into this corner of what I call here high AI-empowered skills. But we also have a nickname for that, which we call is autopilot performance. That's really the performance of the proximal automation as well, and the high risks that some people are having. This is also something that can be associated with vibe coding as well, that is actually spreading around, and many are saying, oh, we just need vibe coders, etc. But what we are also seeing is quite clear, and you could actually hypothesize that, and also it's quite consistent with the model and proposition that I said is only quality can happen when people have sufficient human expertise to be able to perform the oversight and use effectively some of these type of technologies. But then the question becomes is, how do we minimize risks of AI-empowered skills? What trajectories we need to do? And it's a big open challenge we all need to engage and work on. The other thing that I think is potentially really good big opportunity for us to explore is the notion of the metacognitive offloading and unloading. And this synergy between human skills and AI capabilities can only happen when learners are actively metacognitively engaging so that they can make decisions when they can on and offload some of the cognitive tasks in different types of situations. So in other words, what I'm basically trying to say here is that this synergy of high human and AI-empowered skills through the strong metacognitive unloading can happen also only at the high levels of human expertise. In other words, when some people are trying to make the certain shortcuts, and I hear from colleagues teaching different types of subjects. I heard like recently a very passionate speech from a colleague in the US who is teaching introductory programming course, and many students are saying, why do I need to study that? Because ChatGPT can do it. And then when they go to any more advanced programming course, they hit a big brick wall. The only way is to, again, acquire human skills. And the problem is this illusion of the ability that they may get by using some of the generative AI technologies that are really good at solving hello world problems. So this is really some of the critical things. In terms of this adaptivity and the way how much we need to exercise metacognitive control and monitoring and say, hey, we are overwhelming people, what's happening? This is quite speculative, but it's grounded in some of the existing evidence as well. For what we know is when people are developing particular types of new skills, in the beginning, they need to exercise a fair bit of metacognitive monitoring and need to make lots of choices to be sure that they are doing certain things right, when they are doing math, when they are doing writing and everything else. But over time, they actually get much better. They automate how they are performing these type of things, and less active engagement to monitoring is needed. However, when we have now this synergy, we need to learn that skill from the scratch to a certain extent, or how we are synergizing that with a particular AI technology. And in that case, we can expect a certain bump in the metacognitive monitoring until we adapt to that particular situation, develop our own skills to deal with this type of synergy and use it effectively over time. All right, a couple of final remarks before I hand it over for some questions. So I hope I made a case today that AI can enhance human learning, but it can also inhibit it if it's used carelessly. The other important thing is that we should really be very mindful and remind the learners as well. They don't confuse co-pilots with autopilots. Everybody's trying to sell us autopilots, but co-pilots, but people see just the autopilots. But even good pilots know how and when to unload and offload some of the things that to their autopilots. In other words, when to use and when not to use automation, and they still had sufficient human expertise. And then maybe there's a growing opportunity in the future that some researchers are saying that we can see AI, they can learn together with humans and learn from each other. But we are not at that level of the technological development, and lots of different technological and fundamental understanding about the human learning need to happen before we actually get to achieve that particular vision. And so on that very note, thanks so much for your attention and happy to take some of your questions.
Thank you, Dragan. That's wonderful. I've got a number of questions in the chat within Zoom as well as some within the Grail. Or within the Whova. So I'll jump back and forth between them. The first one just says, thank you, this is awesome. I'm experimenting with integrating AI into the assessment process to improve metacognitive skills. For example, having a Socratic rebuttal agent that engages students immediately after the submission to challenge their claims with grounded counter-arguments to expose gaps and strengthens reasoning. The student's defense is transcribed and added to the assessment. This validates that students have agency and ownership of their work, but also requires conversational AI and an AI-led dialogue in real time. Is anyone aware of any research in this area?
Thanks so much. It's a great question. Yes, I am, because we are doing precisely that type of research. We are doing that type of research with medical students, where we basically are using that for simulation-based learning. They are diagnosing virtual patients, but they can also use generative AI to help us part of the diagnosis. In real time, we are analyzing what they are engaging in terms of the history taken from the patient, how they are engaging with generative AI, and we are developing underlying predictive models as well that are assessing students' skills. When we are using just the product, whether they correctly or incorrectly provide diagnosis, that model is not particularly reliable in comparison to the model that is using the process data and then metacognitive data that students are exhibiting in terms of the judgments at the end. So in other words, we can actually provide much better pedagogically informed environments, but also far more reliable assessment of the types of skills. And then that type of assessment is offering also students particular feedback where and how they can do it. So that's one direction. And the other direction is quite relevant to the point I was talking, which I think is quite aligned with your Alexander work about the this proactive agent as well, where you are not only challenging the student, but you are also proactively asking students questions what they need to think about. And what would Chinese say? I'm not giving you a fish, but I'm actually teaching you how to catch the fish yourself. You're on mute, Grace, sorry.
Sorry, I muted while you were talking. What would you like to see the learning community starting or maintaining in their everyday work based on your research so far?
So I would actually like to see far more reliable evidence that is emerging out there. So we see lots of different claims about self-report. Students told us this, told us that, right? And we know from the literature on metacognition and self-regulated learning that we are really not great at self-reporting on different types of situations. So in other words, we need far more process data to understand how actually people are doing certain things. We also want to triangulate that with the students' perceptions of what they are doing, because only through that calibration of the students' perceived and the actual things, the interesting and productive engagement can happen in terms of the pedagogical approaches that we can use to mitigate some of these key challenges. That's number one. Number two is Alexander's previous question as well, is about the assessments. We really need to stop being under this illusion that, hey, there are these AI detector tools. They're not particularly reliable. We know that they have huge false positive rates there, but instead what we want to do is how we can actually equip ourselves and our institutions with different types of novel assessment approaches. Hey, oral exams are fine, but look, 30 years ago when I was an undergrad student, every course had an oral exam. I asked my European friends, everybody's doing oral exams for the last, I don't know how many centuries. So that's not particular innovation. What we can do is to improve students' learning and much more focus on that kind of process-oriented assessment. I think it's really great opportunity. But if you don't want to now sacrifice completely process for the performance, we need to have the balance between the two.
Thank you. There is a huge field of redefining core human skills in the light of AI capabilities. It is potentially very different for different fields of endeavor or learning. The human component has essentially been assessed organically, i.e., experts know best. Do you know of any research being done in this area?
Well, I mean, it's a really big question. We see lots of debates about redefining, and I would echo what Steve is saying, is there experts knows best, but it's really, I would say, lots of theorizing. What is happening, kind of theoretical models, and like what is that kind of composition of the certain types of things. I think there's really only a small researching group of people. Yesterday we had a panel on future-ready skills. Sana Yarrell, I saw her in the room, Inge Molinar in Radboud in the Netherlands, Roger Azevedo, and several are really much deeper engaging into the process data. Also interesting work that is led by recently Mutlu Chukrova that is actually looking into and has a very complementary type of conceptual framing as well of the human skills and everything else, and also looking much more into kind of how we can use much more multimodal data to see what is actually happening versus claiming, hey, I think I know the best.
Okay. Juliana's quite worried about the way Gen AI is invading K-12 schools in a quite underregulated way. She sees a desire of not being left behind from schools, especially in the private systems. How do you see this phenomenon?
Great question. So there are multiple things is first of all, and yesterday we also discussed, is that there's disconnect between decision makers, not only in the high level policy, but also schools or higher education institutions as well, who are acquiring some of these technologies, but they know any of the evidence that I was mentioning, or many people are also working on some of these things. Rather, they basically are feeling, oh, we are missing out on AI, as Juliana says, and we need to buy whatever random technology, but I have no idea what to do there. So that's a quite concerning direction, not only financially, but also what kind of data are being collected about the learners and how to deal with some of these issues. There is no much more that we can do except that we try to actually in our local communities provide more recent evidence, that we engage the schools, that we engage school leaders in particular, to gather some of these evidence and to show them what works, what doesn't work. We also want to emphasize here that lots of these adaptive skills through metacognitive abilities are being developed through adolescents, 12 to 15-year-olds, although it's not still fully understood. So ideally, we want to have very productive ways how we can actually engage with schools so that we can actually get that better understanding. Obviously, we cannot ring fence our learners from AI. They may not have it in school, but they will use it at home. And so we need to engage with AI, but we need to help the teachers to be upskilled and help the school leaders as well to get the right type of evidence, which is really none of this is an easy task. And as Jason Lodge also last night when we had the other panel said, takes many years to get there, and we don't have that much time. So we need to mobilize the community much faster.
Thank you. A couple of questions from Huva. As AI transforms the nature of work and learning, how can universities intentionally cultivate adaptive skills, such as critical thinking, ethical reasoning, digital discernment, that enable students not only to use AI effectively, but to thrive alongside it as creative, responsible contributors to society?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Look, I think I gave a fair bit of examples as well on the way in my presentation. So we obviously can use AI as part of the problem, but could be also part of the solution. So we can actually have lots of these personalized feedback mechanisms that are targeting the better decision making, better choices that learners could be making on their own without telling them this is the right answer, etc. So we want them to actually exercise more of their agency than less in some of these situations. But that also requires much more conceptual thinking to move away. Hey, can I do like oral exams, or can I just basically do all the same, or maybe use AI to criticize whatever AI produced? That's an interesting exercise, but you still need to be immersed into particular types of tasks that learners need to be doing in particular types of situations. In terms of the assessment, I think one of the relatively low cost approaches could be that we ask lots of different types of judgments that students are making about certain types of approaches that we're doing. So when they are doing writing, when they are doing programming, etc., we want them to ask lots of simple questions that are actually embedded into the task about quality of the certain information or the quality of the decision that they made and so on, so that we then get that information back from the students that was collected in real time and then have a good conversation or sending feedback on those choices that were good or bad so that they can more constructively engage in their development.
Thank you. Last question from Seema. Educators and teachers are increasingly using Gen AI feedback to inform their own feedback or in some cases substitute for it. How can teachers provide meaningful feedback that increases students' feedback uptake and metacognitively challenge them and develop evaluative judgment in them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. First and foremost question is, what is the students' and teachers' feedback literacy? And we know it's not greatest, right? So one of the key things is that expecting that you provide a tool, even feedback provisioning tool, and students are immediately going to benefit from them, it's heavily disproven in the literature for the last 20 plus years. In other words, we need to embed these feedback exercises into our curriculum, into our learning designs, so that learners are then carefully scaffolded to engage with the feedback and also created types of tasks that, for example, David Vowd and others are saying that they are getting that actionable feedback so that they can demonstrate improvement in the following tasks as well. If the feedback happens only at the end, nobody's going to engage in that feedback. But if there's actually building on that feedback for the next task and so on, that is potentially relevant. We are seeing lots of these AI tools that are available now to the students, even in our university, but very little uptake, primarily because of the lack of the embedding of the curriculum design and really insufficient understanding, not only by the students, but also by educators, what to do with this type of technology.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Gasevic. It's been wonderful as always listening to you and engaging with you. Everybody's, you can just see they're very great areas of research. Thank you. Amazing. Thank you very much. So thank you again for presenting at Eli. We appreciate it. Everyone else, we're going to have a bit of a gap now between Dragan's session and the next one, about 5 hours, which allows people in Australia and Asia to grab a bit of dinner, to grab a bit of break from going on. And then we've got another 10 sessions coming on, still another 2 different sets of keynotes that will happen over commencing in 5 hours from now. We've got our final tranche. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Professor Gasevic. Look forward to hearing more.